Now is a good time to start talking about getting input from the user in console applications. So imagine you're writing a program that returns the square of a number that the user puts in. Without letting the user edit the code, how would you write this? Well, the first thing we would need to know how to use is this little input function. The input function is a function like all our others, which means it's followed by a parentheses, and its parameter is a string. In this case, the string is enter an integer followed by a colon and a space. When it's run, it prints that text to the user and then lets them enter some input. So here we always highlight the input that the user puts in during our output phase in red, and we bold it. And usually it'll follow a colon as well. So when the computer runs line 1, it prints out enter an integer and waits for the user to enter something. It won't progress to the next line until the user actually inputs something. So here, our input was 5. Then on line 2, it tries to print my user input, which was the variable to which we assigned the value the user entered, times my user input, which is kind of a lazy way to square something, just multiply it by itself. The result, though, is a type error. And the reason it's a type error is because we can't multiply a string times a string. But the user didn't enter a string, right? They entered a number. They entered the number 5. But the computer doesn't know that. The computer interprets anything that the user enters as a string of characters because it has no way of knowing that it's a number. The user could have entered their name, they could have entered today's date, they could have just slammed the keyboard a few times and just entered whatever came out. The computer doesn't know that that's an integer. And so when we try to multiply the input times the input, the computer sees it as trying to multiply sandwich times Sovngarde or something. It has no way of making sense of that. So to do this, we need to convert the user's input to an integer. You can see that behavior in a little bit more clarity here. On line 1, we prompt the user to enter an integer, and they enter 5. But on line 2, we print the type of the value to which we assign their input, and Python sees the type as a string. The same thing happens when the user enters 5.1, which we recognize as a floating point number. Python still recognizes it as a string. And sometimes that's beneficial. Here, the user has entered the string, hello world. That really is just text. And so, it's also a string. Python interprets all of them as strings until it's told to do something else. So what do we need to do to make our original example work? We need to convert my user input into an integer. Line 1 calls the input function with enter an integer as the prompt. And so enter an integer is printed, and we wait for the user to enter their input. In this case, it's 5 again. And so 5 is now stored as my user input. My user input is a variable now with the value 5. Right now it's a string though, because the user just entered it. So on line 2, we create a new variable, my user input as int, and we set it equal to the integer conversion of the user input. Here, they entered the number 5, which is in fact an integer, and so that conversion works just fine. So my user input as int now has the value 5. Not in quotation marks, now it's actually interpreting it as a number. Then on line 3, because my user input as int is in fact an integer, we can do my user input as int times my user input as int. The computer looks up the value of each of these and finds that each one has the value 5. So this basically becomes print 5 times 5. 5 times 5 becomes 25. So this becomes print 25. And that's exactly what the computer does. Note though, that when the user entered 5, they could have actually entered whatever they wanted. Try this out and see what happens when you enter other input. What you'll find is that if you don't enter an integer when prompted, this code crashes. It tries to do that int conversion on your input, but if your input wasn't actually an integer, then it can't convert it from a string to an integer. There are 2 ways we could avoid that. We could check to see if the input represents an integer before actually trying that conversion, or we could try the conversion and just tell our code how to recover if it hits an error. We'll talk about the first method when we cover strings in Unit 4, and we'll talk about the second method when we talk about error handling in Unit 3.